Welcome back, everyone. Today we are joined on the podcast with Paul Massaro. He is a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and he focuses on anti-corruption efforts and legislation both in Washington, D.C. and the EU. He's a big supporter of Ukraine on social media. He recently started a YouTube channel, but he has a much larger following on Twitter, I think about 350,000 followers. Paul, thank you so much for joining the channel. How are you doing today?
Jake, doing great. Thank you so much for having me. Longtime admirer of your work on YouTube, so it's really a big pleasure to be here.
I've also been following you on Twitter for the last couple months. Excited to have you here. And my first question for you is, the first thing I noticed about your Twitter page is you have a photo of you and President Zelensky shaking hands as your banner picture. So my immediate first question I have to ask is, when was the last time you were in Ukraine? Why were you there? And how were you able to meet President Zelensky when a war is going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Well, look, I went to Ukraine in September and late August. And, since the outbreak of this horrific genocidal full-scale invasion, to me, there is nothing more important in the entire world than Ukrainian victory. As a U.S. national security professional and, just kind of someone who personally very much cares about the sort of basic American values and really what I see as universal values of basic human dignity and basic human rights and that sort of thing. And I think also for you as an Air Force vet, someone who's also been a part of the sort of U.S. government apparatus, this is the number one thing we need to be focused on. So we were working on this. However, because of the way that this has been approached by the U.S. government, the way that the administration has decided to approach this invasion, there are very few opportunities to actually go to Ukraine. And I felt I needed to go. So what I did, Jake, is I took PTO, I took paid time off. And I took sort of a vacation. I got in touch with my friends in the Georgian Legion, who are these incredible sort of foreign fighters from Georgia. They all have big beards. That's actually when I grew my beard when I was over there, so I could blend in a little more. There's kind of this saying in Ukraine at the moment that I'll shave after victory, right? All these soldiers growing their beards, and of course the Georgians all have beards and everything. So I went over and they kind of I enmeshed with them. And they took me around. We went to Lviv, we went to Kiev. We went actually way to the front line in Zaporizhia, just miles from the nuclear power plant. So it was extraordinary to kind of see all this firsthand. And you really can't understand it until you see it all firsthand, right? Ukraine is massive, sort of the enormity of what Ukraine is fighting here. It just can't be appreciated until you sort of drive through the country, which is, of course, the biggest European country. It's the biggest one. Again, it's like their front is the distance from London to Kiev. That's their front that they're fighting the Russians on. So, it was eye-opening. Of course, getting in with Zelensky, with President Zelensky, that was quite a feat. That was thanks to some of my Polish friends, who, of course, the Poles have been, I think just you've seen, and I've seen your videos, the Poles have been just absolutely extraordinary allies to us, to the Ukrainians, from day one, understanding the stakes of this, not hesitating, not waiting, getting the Ukrainians what they need to win. So, of course, they have very deep connections now with the Ukrainian government, and I have deep connections with them, being someone that has also been supportive from day one. And they helped to arrange this meeting. And boy, it was an incredible treat, right? It just unbelievable to meet this singular individual who, has been called over and over and over again, kind of the Winston Churchill of our time. And he is. He's heroic. He's charismatic. He's exciting, and we had a discussion, right? We talked about, what more can Ukraine do to get what it needs? And my recommendation, of course, was, because I'm always the money guy, is we need to take Russia's money in the West. We need to take Russia's reserves. We need to take Russian oligarch money, which, thanks to actually his intervention very late and his trip to the United States, we succeeded at this Congress. We actually passed a law that will allow the administration to send recovered oligarch assets to Ukraine.
That's a huge victory that gets me pretty excited. I also like thinking about and talking about the money aspect of this war. So you just said that the number one issue in the world to people should be this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So for the audience members out there, maybe watching this podcast where this, they're paying attention, but they don't believe it's the number one issue for them. What is the argument that you can make for people living in democratic Western countries? Why should a Ukrainian victory be one of their top priorities?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. And I'll just say that I think there a lot of rhetoric swirls around Twitter and YouTube and wherever else about World War III and how, if we give Ukraine too much, or if we antagonize Russia or provoke Russia, or all this kind of silly gobbledygook, then it will cause World War III. And I want to say very plainly, Ukrainians are preventing World War III. They prevented World War III already. I mean, when Russia invaded, and when we all thought Kiev would fall in 3 days, we were ready to lose. Remember, we the United States, went in and said, "We're getting you out of here, Zelensky. We're getting you out of here. We're getting everybody. We're going to have a government in exile. Get out." And Zelensky looked at our guys right in the eye and said, I don't need an evacuation. I need ammunition, right? And then the Ukrainians put up this unbelievably valiant defense, which has since prevented Russia from pushing further, right? Pushing further into Poland, into Lithuania, into a NATO country, which would trigger Article 5 and, of course, lead to a pretty massive conflict, cause U.S. boots on the ground. All of this stuff that I think, for the most part, American citizens have generally said, yeah, we don't really want that. Well, you don't have that, and you are protected because of the valor of Ukrainians. Beyond that, when one looks to China, right? I mean, there was this what looked like a pretty clear agreement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at the Genocide Olympics, as we call them, because they were held, taking place in China at a time when China is engaged in this genocide against the Uyghurs. Okay, Russia would wait until the end of the Olympics to invade, and did. And after the 3-day invasion, there was a sort of this expectation that there would be an invasion of Taiwan, which, I mean, would also necessitate a U.S. response. So, I mean, there's real reason to believe, a very strong reason to believe, that Ukraine is protecting all of us, that it's preserving U.S. national security, that's preserving global security. I mean, I don't think anyone's put it better than President Zelensky when he was in the United States addressing Congress, when he said, "This is not charity. This is not charity. This is an investment in global security," which they've handled unbelievably responsibly. This is maybe the best investment the United States has ever made in our foreign policy history. I mean, for a small fraction of our annual national security budget, I mean, a small fraction. And I saw, Jake, you did some wonderful math on this in one of your videos where you basically took it down to 83 cents a day for 1 year for taxpaying Americans to preserve U.S. national security, topple the Russian Empire, protect democracy, prevent an invasion of Taiwan. I mean, it's the best. It's the best possible thing we could do.
And for people who complain about the dollar amount being sent to Ukraine, if you just compare it to foreign military aid that we give to Saudi Arabia or Israel or Taiwan, it's not an unreasonable number for what the Ukrainians are achieving.
Absolutely.
My next question to you, you stated in one of your videos, and I like the way you put this. You said their money came west rather than democratic values going east. Can you talk about how Russian and Chinese money has been infiltrating and corrupting Western democracies?
Yes, and thank you for this question. This is kind of my hobby horse, let's say. I mean, this is something that I work on day in, day out, both in my professional life and in my personal life. This is maybe the reason that the post-Cold War order failed. I mean, there's this kind of notion and philosophical underpinning of liberal triumphalism that followed the end of the Soviet Union and the opening of China. And this was the notion that if we economically integrate with these very large authoritarian powers, then what will follow is democratization. I think the Germans have a very nice name for this when they call it Wandel durch Handel, or change through trade, okay? It's not only the Germans that believed in this, of course. It was the United States as well. And because liberalism had won and because democracy had won, money coming west or working for these individuals was just expediting kind of the end of history, expediting the transformation to democracy and so on and so forth. I mean, the blinders we had on were just really extraordinary as we invited this money. And we really genuinely, I think, believed, idiotically in hindsight, that we could both be greedy and good, right? I mean, kind of this feeling of, wow, we can have all this money, bring it into our systems, and there will be no repercussions from this. And of course, that's not how it went.
That famous quote, if two countries both have McDonald's, they won't go to war with each other.
Right. So this is exactly it. I mean, we kind of diluted ourselves, right, into believing our own kind of propaganda, in a sense. And this was driven, I think, again, both by well-meaningness and this notion that it was our values that collapsed the Soviet Union, when in fact it was significantly more complicated than that, and just greed. Just plain, wow, what an opportunity to make money. And a lot of people made a lot of money. And this generated a number of different industries that have become now kind of the bread and butter of DC. And one of the main ones, there's two that I really want to focus on and that I focus on when I talk about this. And the one is professional enablers, and the other is political enablers. So the professional enablers are lawyers and real estate professionals and accountants and auditors and all of these individuals who are essentially financial gatekeepers. And what they've done is they've provided, they kind of accept all this authoritarian cash to look the other way and help to launder money and to sort of, sue journalists who may be investigating money, sue them into submission. This is something we see a lot in the UK, sort of abusive libel lawsuits, and all sorts of this stuff, so that they can kind of whitewash the money and reputations of these individuals and enable them to access our systems. This leads to the second type of enabler, which is the political enabler, okay? These are former officials for the most part. This is kind of delayed onset bribery, where there's this whole industry of firms, mercenary lobbying firms and lobby lawyer firms and all this other kind of stuff in DC, where former officials go after they've spent 20 years or whatever working on these, low-paying government jobs, and then they end up working directly for these authoritarian actors, essentially enabling them to have access to our political system. They act as lobbyists or consultants in some cases. But in any case, what they're trying to do is influence our policies. And you see how one leads to the other. So you need the professionals to launder the money so that that money can then be handed off to the politicals. And this has become an ecosystem of global corruption. It's undermined our policy response for years to Russian aggression. I mean, I just, when people kind of wonder, where did this come from, right? It's obvious, right? I mean, Russia, basically Putin in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference said, I'm going to do all this. And then in 2008, he invaded Georgia. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine. This is, every Ukrainian will tell you this war started in 2014. He's been assassinating people in DC. He's been assassinating people in London. He's been assassinating people in Berlin. He's been abusing Interpol. I mean, Russia has been a rogue state for almost 20 years, right? But because they had such influence in the political class in the West, we just kind of turned a blind eye to all this until finally, we simply could not ignore it any longer because Ukraine fought back. And I'll bet my bottom dollar, if Ukraine had lost, if Ukraine hadn't fought back, if Zelensky had taken the ride, we would have accepted the domination of Ukraine and waited for the invasion of Poland or Lithuania or whatever would come next. We were that deep in this muck, and the Ukrainians have helped us to escape, or at least given us another chance.
Well, if Ukraine had fallen on a Friday, Moldova would have fallen on a Monday.
Yep, that's right. That's exactly right.
You've stated this in a video. I just want to reiterate it to the audience, but only commercial banks have a legal requirement to kind of ask questions. Where is this money coming from? But as you said, all of these other enablers, lawyers, real estate agents, they don't have any legal requirement to ask questions. Where are these millions or billions of dollars coming from that Ivan keeps sending to me?
Yes.
So let's talk about a specific example that I didn't know about until I watched one of your videos. But can you walk through a specific example of how corruption has influenced Germany to the highest level with the Nord Stream Pipeline 1?
Yes. I mean, it's the grand strategic corruption story. So, thanks for asking about it. I mean, I think it really demonstrates the threat of strategic corruption. So, I mean, Russia in particular has really succeeded at co-opting high-level European officials. They co-opted, a former prime minister of France, François Fillon. They co-opted a former foreign minister of Austria, Karen Kneißl. And then, of course, their golden goose, their top guy is Gerhard Schröder, a former German chancellor. A chancellor. I mean, just even like the notion that a former German chancellor works for Russia should give us all pause. I mean, if President Obama worked for Huawei, we would never, ever hear the end of it. I mean, even what? Like, what is going on here? And I mean, this really comes down to one of the kind of the biggest and most obvious cases. So Gerhard Schröder, who is, just like sleazeball extraordinaire.
When did he leave office?
He left office in 2005, I believe. So while he's in office, he agrees to the creation of Nord Stream 1. Okay? He signs Germany up. 1 year after leaving office, he is the head of Nord Stream AG, which is Allgemeine Gesellschaft, which is the, incorporated basically. So the company that is running Nord Stream, he's running it. So like I mean, the cycle of revolving door, the cycle of delayed onset bribery here is just like unbelievably clear. He was straight up bribed basically with the promise of lucrative employment after office into, establishing and addicting Germany to Russian gas. And this becomes an enormous problem over the next 15 years. So the addiction begins, and Gerhard Schröder keeps bringing, Russian lobbyists in to uses his contacts because, of course, he's top guy in the Social Democrats network and in German politics. So he's a Social Democrat, SPD. And, they are part of the grand coalitions of Germany under Merkel, again and again and again. And of course, Merkel doesn't oppose this either. She ends up beginning to see it as kind of like what's done is done, and we're getting gas, and gas has become so critical to German, to like a lot of German industry.
And that nice Vladimir Putin speaks German.
I know, and he speaks German, and he's coming, he's addressed the Bundestag in German and all that kind of stuff. So it just gets worse and worse and worse. And the gas ministry starts getting filled with co-opted people, and the foreign ministry starts getting filled with co-opted people. And before you know it, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, basically the German CIA, gets filled with pro-Russian people. I mean, we have literally, in the course of this whole kind of new era since February 24th, we have seen German spies who are handing our information over to the Russians. I mean, they're co-opted from the top down, okay? And this all starts with this co-option of this top dog, Schröder, and then it kind of just evolves from there. And Merkel very much goes along with it. Merkel very much is part of the problem. She very much sees it. But this is exactly how it works. So they find this incredible way in, and then from then on, they co-opt every single level. And of course, when we look at the top dogs, when we look at the former cabinet officials, when we look at the former members of Congress, okay, there are former members of Congress that work for Hikvision, which does surveillance on Uyghurs who are being, forcibly sterilized and indoctrinated and killed in Xinjiang by the Chinese Communist Party. And you have former members of Congress lobbying for this company, okay? And, Podesta, who ran Clinton's campaign, lobbies for Huawei, which of course I don't think I need to necessarily explain what Huawei is. I mean, very well known that they, are a 5G company that builds these kind of backdoors into their technology so that the CCP can spy on everybody, and so on and so forth. So, this is how strategic corruption works, is they've co-opted us. They get us in their pockets, and the top is the most obvious stuff is just the tip of the iceberg. It goes way, way, way down, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger with the middle level guys and then the bottom, and everybody just keeps exiting government into these firms and into these firms and into these, whether they're mercenary firms or whether it's directly for the company, they keep this keeps going, and it's so easy for these guys to do.
I do want to throw in a legal disclaimer for our audience that there is a difference between something being corrupt and something being illegal.
Yes.
They are not inclusive. You can be engaging in corruption where it's obvious to everyone that this is immoral and wrong to do and kind of traitorous, but there is no law preventing a member of Congress from leaving office, and maybe there's a certain period of time, but eventually taking a nice salaried position. And the number I've seen you throw out is about $500,000. If you want to buy a Western Democratic government official, promise them a job. If they give you what they want while they're in power, promise them a job after they get out that pays about $500,000. To an authoritarian regime worth hundreds of billions, Putin and Western banks had $300 billion frozen. Chucking $500,000 at some nobody to get them to support your legislation you want passed in Germany or the United States or Canada or the UK, $500,000 is a speeding ticket for these authoritarian regimes. Since I got you, can I ask, is there any kind of conspiracy that Germany not pursuing nuclear power or taking nuclear power plants offline, was this a Russian idea? Was it a Russian motivation to get Germany and the EU addicted on natural gas? Were they pushing, because there are legitimate arguments against nuclear power. I don't want to diminish the debate, but I guarantee you there's a lot of people in the EU saying right now, maybe we should have some more nuclear power.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it kind of gets to the core of why all this. And I, Jake, I mean, I completely endorse everything you said about the difference between criminality and corruption. And I want to say this is primarily the problem, right? And it's important to recognize that, like, what we need to do is start criminalizing some of this conduct, right? I mean, we need to start saying this is not acceptable. But I mean, it's a great question, because I think this conspiratorial thinking, okay, which you see also in the USA and has come to define almost our politics with QAnon and all this kind of other stuff, is the product of when people just cannot tell where the legitimate stuff ends and the corruption begins. I mean, was it? I mean, that's the whole thing, is it's all mixed together, and it's like, okay, was this legit German idea, or was it a Russian plant? I mean, I think in the case of anti-nuclear power, it was really from the Greens, and it was a legit German-sprung idea. Now, were there kind of environmental organizations backed by Russia or something like that helped kind of push on the idea? I mean, what Russia loves to do is exacerbate cleavages that already exist, right? I mean, like, in the U.S. context, I mean, Russia didn't invent racism in the USA. Like we did that plenty good ourselves, but they come in and they try to exacerbate whatever those cleavages are and make it so that our fights become more heated and everything is worse than it would otherwise be, right? And I do think that they succeeded at doing that in the German context. But, I mean, as far as really getting Germany addicted to natural gas, I think that was absolutely the Russian plan, and they did it through corruption, and they did it it was a great strategic victory, and would have continued if not for the valiant defense of Kiev by the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians' defense of Ukraine. I mean, there was no indication whatsoever that Germany was ever going to give up Nord Stream 2. I mean, up until the bitter end, like January of 2022, we had German diplomats telling us Nord Stream 2 is only a commercial deal, right? I mean, even though it obviously wasn't, you still had that. But what really changed everything was the fact that, like, the whole tower of cards came crashing down in the most profound way, and you couldn't even pretend not to believe it any longer. You could create this fantasy about what Russia is. But after you see what they've done in Ukraine, you simply can no longer live in that fantasy.
I want to give a shout out to a previous podcast guest, real quick, Vlad Vexler. And what you're describing is modern Russian propaganda, modern Russian disinformation. They pump both sides. They pump both Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter because they're trying to amplify confusion and chaos and cause division within democracies. We have free speech, we have the right to protest. Russia just wants chaos. So modern disinformation is echo and amplify all aspects and sides so that people get confused and people feel like, well, I guess we'll never know what the truth is. We'll never know what reality is. That is the only space that the modern Russian state is able to navigate and operate in. My next question to you is, how has politics in Europe changed this year? More examples as a result of Ukraine's valiant defense.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, great questions, man. I in the first few weeks after February 24th, I was so excited. I sort of felt like the European Union was moving faster than the United States. And I was like, oh my God, like all the things that I'd recommended for years and years and years and years, hitting the oligarchs, knocking out, all these strategic corruption networks, abandoning Nord Stream 2, finally. It all happened so quickly. Scholz gave this, Chancellor Scholz gave this incredible speech on the Zeitenwende and how Germany was wrong and how they'd never again engage in dialogue for dialogue's sake, which really kills Europe. And then, of course, things I didn't even expect, like the freezing of reserves. That was brilliant. That was just like, so I really got to give props out the gate to the EU and to kind of the decisiveness that appeared out the gate. And I think out the gate, there was still a hope that we're going to slam them and there's going to be such a huge economic cost that they're going to get out of there, right? And then when that didn't happen, there was almost this kind of like loss of like a recognition that things are never going to go back to normal, are they? Like a very slow recognition of, oh my God, at first there was this hope that we'd slam them really hard and then they go back and it'd basically just be a fluke, and everything would kind of go back to normal. But the reality now is the long adaptation, particularly by Germany, but by a lot of other countries as well, of kind of the recognition of what the Central and Eastern Europeans have been saying for 20 years, right? And that's that Russia's not any different than it's been for 800 years. And it's basically an imperial horde that is always going to be based on this, kind of deep set, identity of domination of its population and its neighbors. And that you need to adapt to that. And for the Germans, this is an extremely difficult thing to do, right? I was in Germany in July, and the way I describe it is as deer in the headlights, because basically 30 years of politics are now out the window. 30 years of designing your economic model around cheap Russian gas, make cars and chemicals and that sort of thing, and then send it to China, right?
Sell it to China, yeah.
This whole economic model is collapsing before their eyes. The Russian piece is completely out, and the Chinese piece is also disappearing. So Germany's like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And Germans have begun, very softly whispering about, are we going to deindustrialize like the UK and France and the rest of Europe and the USA basically has? Germany, through basically cheating, through integrating and with China and Russia and accepting corruption, they delayed kind of the transformation of their economy in the way that we've seen in other countries. But the reality is that, that was never sustainable. And that's what we told them for years and years and years and years. And now they finally have to face facts. I think that it's taking a long time. It's taking too long, and Ukrainians are dying in the meantime. And it's really terrible. And, risks remain up. But they really have no choice but to change. So European politics fundamentally has no choice but to change, because the whole notion that they were ever going to be, they like to talk about themselves, Sonderweg, that's a special way, or Mittellage, sort of the middle place. They were never going to be that, because the bottom line is the Germany and France and the European Union, shares some really core values with the United States that at the end of the day are going to come into question if you remain integrated with Russia, if you remain integrated with China, because the Chinese system and the Russian system view these values as anathema. I mean, one of the reasons that's constantly been cited as to why this, invasion has happened is that Ukraine is a democracy, right? Ukraine is a human rights respecting rule of law democracy, and that a successful Ukraine poses a threat to Russia. And that's because of its success. Its success poses a threat to Russia. Not anything about Ukrainian military, anything like that, just the success of Ukraine, because it would mean that the Russian model is not necessary and is not the only way.
Since you know a lot about sanctions, I want to ask you the question, why hasn't the Russian economy collapsed yet? And a follow-up to that question, is there anything that Western governments haven't done yet so far as sanctions that they should immediately do?
Yeah, so the number one reason, sort of by a mile, that Russia's been able to sustain itself for as long as it has is that Europe in particular kept buying gas and to a lesser extent oil up until just a few months ago, right? When it was actually Russia that, sabotaged Nord Stream and parts of Nord Stream 2 and stopped sending gas to Europe in the hope that, oh, we're going to stop sending gas and then you're going to have to surrender, right? And or you're going to have to stop supporting Ukraine or whatever. And for the longest time, I kept saying, oh my God, we need to stop buying this stuff. We need to stop buying this stuff. Europe needs to stop buying this stuff. But boy, it would be great if Russia just did it themselves, and then they finally did, and so when you look at Politico Europe had a really good chart on this. It was going around Twitter just recently that basically demonstrated that trade had actually gone up with Russia since the invasion. And a lot of that is probably the high price of gas and oil and the fact that for the most part, Europe did not stop buying gas and oil. And now there's kind of this oil price cap, which is excellent. Coal has been phased out and Russia stopped selling gas. So effectively gas is over. So that whole piece, the natural resources piece, should be basically solved now. I mean, there's going to be attempts by Russia to get past the oil cap, which of course right now the oil cap isn't even in effect because it was set too high. The price of oil is actually too low, so it's not even hitting the cap. So they're going to try to find other ways to sell their oil. But gas is really something you sell via pipelines, and the pipelines are to Europe. So that thing is over. Now there's all kinds of other ways that Russia has kind of used capital controls to, stop foreign exchange and currency from leaving the country and that sort of thing to kind of manipulate the strength of their currency. But the biggest part of all this is natural resource sales, which should be over now. So the sanctions really should start to bite, because that's what was left.
I know that Russia is already running budget deficits every month, and yeah, maybe they had some foreign reserves, but those are only going to last so long. At that point, Russia doesn't have access to the international bond markets, so either they're printing money to pay their bills, or there's some stream of revenue that we don't know about. My next question to you is, what does Russia's future look like after a defeat on the battlefield? I do think the Russian military is going to be expelled from Ukraine this year. It's at that point that peace negotiations can go forward. But if the Russian state doesn't manage to politically and economically collapse, what does their future potentially look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I give a lot of thought to. And I think it's a discussion that more should be having, because everyone keeps asking, well, what's the end of the war look like? What's the end of the war look like? And to me, that's very obvious. I mean, that's the first thing that the end of the war necessitates is complete and total Ukrainian victory, right? So, I mean, every Russian soldier is out of Ukraine, and I mean, Ukraine is restored to its 1991 sovereign borders, and that's that, which includes Crimea and the Eastern Donbass. So that's kind of step one. Now, what do you get out of Russia after that is an excellent question. I mean, I think the most likely scenario, and again, it's hard to forecast this kind of stuff, but just from what we've seen of Russia and what we've seen of kind of the brainwashing of, on one hand, the brainwashing, and on the other hand, kind of the identity of the Russian people, there hasn't been an awful lot of protests against this war, right? I mean, it's a sad fact that we have to acknowledge that the Russian people have largely supported this awful genocidal invasion, and even when they fled mobilization, they kind of go abroad to Tbilisi or to Berlin or whatever, and then they kind of support the war from there, so it's kind of it's a really tough thing to say that there's going to be kind of a mass uprising or something. Some people say, well, Russians don't like to lose, and I guess that's true, but I also think it's very possible that Putin's going to say, well, we won. Even a loss is a victory, because they'll use the propaganda apparatus and say, we killed a lot of Ukrainians, we denazified Ukraine, Mariupol doesn't exist anymore, blah, 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 whatever. And then everyone will kind of breathe a sigh of relief that it's over or something and kind of go back to normal. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon us in the West and in the G7 to hold the sanctions on and not let ourselves be duped again back into, like we were in 1991, to integrating Russia into the international system. I think that we need to demand certain things. I do not think we should reintegrate Russia until we see some level of demilitarization of Russia, a serious demilitarization, denuclearization of Russia. It's really extraordinary that we have, and I know, Jake, you were in the nukes and missiles part of our military and the Air Force, and I'd love to hear your insights into this. But the way that Russia comports itself as a nuclear power, I don't know how humanity can feel okay with this. You simply cannot have a country with nuclear weapons constantly threatening to use them at the drop of the hat everywhere. Now, I think it is all posturing, but that doesn't change the fact that they are threatening to use them. And this has to be the red line for everyone. China, India, Brazil, whoever is a fence sitter needs to kind of see nuclear weapons as an absolute red line, no nuclear weapon use. That's really, really critical. So I think that where Russia heads and where Russia can be successful and the Russians can be successful and the Ukrainians can be successful and there can kind of be peace and prosperity and democracy in the region will necessitate almost an entirely new identity for Russia, will necessitate giving the autonomous republics and regions an opportunity at self-government, whether that's as part of a federation or, on their own, is kind of up in the air. But I think the biggest thing is we need to be ready not to reintegrate Russia. We need to be ready not to any longer be complicit in these crimes.
On your point about nuclear weapons, I think as long as the Kremlin is still standing, they're never going to give up all their nuclear weapons. But I think in order to have sanctions lifted and economic integration, we're talking about a post-Putin world. So a future government of Russia, democratic or authoritarian, whatever. They're never going to give up nukes, but I think we could convince them to lower them to a more reasonable number. A number comparable to France, the UK, or China. Get it down to 300 or 600. We'll even let them have a moral victory and say they have the most, because I think the United States would be willing, bilaterally with enforcement and inspections, to also reduce their nuclear stockpile. This is what we've been doing since Nixon in 1972. And it's to the United States' benefit, because more than likely, Russia is being careless and sloppy, and there could be a nuclear incident at any moment. These nukes might end up in the Middle East, in Syria or Iran or wherever. So I think the United States would, I'm sure those talks have already begun, saying, okay, well, this is what the plan would be. But would the Kremlin ever go to zero? And I don't think they would. I don't think they would. Look what happened to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. It's ironic that Russia would look at their own example of aggression against a neighbor and say, well, we're never going to let that happen to us, what we did to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, we'll see though, because I mean, the reality is, after all of this, it's going to be Ukraine that is the beacon of democracy and freedom and prosperity, and Russia's going to look like it already does, looks like a pathetic backwater. I mean, I think the future of Ukraine is really NATO, the EU. I mean, already is so innovative and creative. I mean, when this whole history is played out, and when you look at independent Ukraine, I mean, I really think that people are going to be like, wow, Ukraine made the right choices along the way that enabled this, while Russia was clinging to this imperial notion of great power status that ultimately does not serve it well at all.
I mean, we're talking about 5-10 years down the road, the war is over. But I think for Ukraine, they'll have economic integration into the EU. Hopefully, their people are very active in preventing corruption in their governments. They continue protesting, they continue marching, they continue holding their elected representatives accountable so that they do have a honest, fair, and just society. But I think the future of Ukraine is probably letting in Russian immigrants. I think with such a huge border and such similarities in history, culture, language, all that stuff, I think this is what Putin and his regime fears, is a prosperous, capitalist, not corrupt, democratic neighbor in which people who want a better life will just say, well, if I can get across that border, I'll do much better than living in basically a larger version of North Korea, which is where Russia is heading.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't imagine a large Russian emigre population in Ukraine at the moment, and I'd have to see how that Ukrainian perspectives toward Russia develop in the next 10 to 20. I mean, we really need to.
What I'm talking about is when you think about economics, you need population growth in order to have economic growth. That is what drives tax revenue in order to pay for everything in society. And I think Ukraine has been dealt a serious blow in that I think a lot of these millions of refugees who have left the country, they're never going back. Millions of them will go back, but I think there are lots of people who have settled in the UK or France or Spain, and they're learning the local language, they're taking local jobs, and they might never move back to Ukraine. So for Ukraine to have economic prosperity in the future, I think they're going to have to start letting in immigrants. And I think the most logical choice are younger Russians who want a better life, who are enthusiastic about becoming a member of the EU if that is what Ukraine has in their future.
Maybe. I mean, maybe, again, it's hard to imagine just because, again, like the feeling toward Russians right now in Ukraine is very, 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 very bad. I mean, and rightfully so.
Towards Russians who support the war. What about Russians who oppose the war? I don't hold any animosity towards those individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what they'd tell you is,
they could just lie.
They could lie, but I mean, I'm channeling my inner Ukrainian. I mean, they would tell you that, there really aren't Russians that oppose the war, and if there were, they would be protesting in Moscow, and if they were, they wouldn't have put Putin in power, and so on and so forth. So I mean, and I think there's a lot of logic in that perspective that we often don't see in the West. I think that our kind of Western way of seeing things, and I think it's also a very American way of seeing things, is, there's the dictator and there's the people, and these things are separate. And the dictator basically doesn't have the best interest of the people in mind, and the people is basically held captive to the dictator. And I think this is true in a system like maybe the Islamic Republic of Iran, where it definitely seems like, the people have risen up, and they're trying to overthrow the dictator. But in Russia, it's hard for me to believe that, and in Russia, it seems like the demonstration has been the opposite, that the people have largely supported their dictator. And I think that maybe in 10, 15 years, maybe there's a handful of young Russians who are, who just leave when they're teens or something and haven't been a part of this. But I mean, we're dealing with something I think very, very, very complicated in Russia. I mean, the closest analogy I can think of is kind of the, I've cited before, kind of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the creation of the Turk. I mean, if you went to like 19th century Ottoman Empire, there weren't Turks, right? I mean, they were kind of, what is a Turk? There's a bunch of people and there's kind of the Ottoman ruling class. And that's kind of what Russia is. It's kind of like there's like, what is Russian? What is it to be Russian? I mean, they claim certain parts. To be Russian is to claim certain parts of Ukrainian history as your own and to view Ukrainians as beneath you. And that's like intrinsically part of being Russian. So it's like you need to kind of almost invent a new Russian identity. Maybe once that is done, I've kind of before said maybe it'll be Muscovite or Novgorodian or whatever it is, then you can have kind of a rapprochement between Ukraine and Russia. But so long as like the core Russian identity views Ukraine as less than itself and as worthy only of domination and also as really rightfully part of its territory. Right, that's kind of like when in the Russian myth. I mean, the Kievan Rus and kind of how they view themselves as Great Rus is Ukraine is part of our territory, and Ukrainians don't exist. I mean, this is what Putin says, right? And they're only worthy of domination and control. They're little Russians, right? So I mean, until that changes, you're going to have a hard time at rapprochement. Because I'd like for your vision to come true. Obviously, like I would like for peace and prosperity and democracy, right? But I just think that we've kind of, this is a really, really complicated identity situation. And I guess I've learned a lot from listening to Ukrainians who just, they tell me we're wrong. We've seen this wrongly for a very long time.
You probably know this, but something I learned about the Russian language is they have two different words for Russian. They have Ruski and they have Russiana. They have two different words for the nationality being Russian and the ethnicity being Russian. So when they're speaking, you can't confuse the two. When I talk, in American politics, we talk about, oh, these are real Americans, as opposed to who. In the Russian language, you can't do that. You have to specify which you're talking about. And a comment that I got on my channel yesterday, I want to share this with you. In my last update video, I talked about how the statue of Catherine the Great in Odessa was taken down finally, and it should be. It has no point in being there.
Yes.
And some Russian troll was saying, what do you mean it has no point being there? She founded the city. And then, I don't interact with the trolls. I know I shouldn't, but I wanted to type back. I'm like, so nobody lived there prior to 1794? Like the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire. No people and no structures existed on this bank prior to 1794. So this idea of, oh, well, she founded the city, you're acknowledging that, or you're erasing the history and the people that have lived there for thousands of years. So if people and culture and structures existed in Odessa prior to 1794, and Russia no longer controls the city, then that statue and their history and Catherine the Great has no meaning, no significance. Of course, that statue should be taken down. If they really want to, maybe they could even rename the city.
Well, I mean, they have renamed a lot of their cities, right? Dnipro, for example, in Soviet times was, and I mean, actually, as recently as like the 2000s, I think, was Dnipropetrovsk, and it was like a Russian name tacked onto the Ukrainian name, and they did this with a lot of different Ukrainian cities. It was a way to Russify the population.
Yeah,
right, exactly. So that's very right. And
Kharkiv and Kharkov. There's the Russian name for Kharkiv. Yeah. When Russian propagandists talk about Kharkiv, they say Kharkov.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, right? I mean, even Odessa is spelled with two S's in Russian, right? I mean, and the Donbass is spelled with two S's, and so on and so forth. So there's kind of like there's always this fight where Russia's trying to show the Ukrainian language doesn't exist, the Ukrainian people don't exist, they're just Russians. Catherine the Great in particular was like one of the big initial Russify Ukraine people. She tried to wipe Ukrainian identity off the face of the earth. I mean, that was one of her big initiatives as emperor of the Russian, as empress of the Russian Empire. So, I mean, Catherine the Great in particular, is genuinely and horrifyingly insulting for a Ukrainian to be forced to look upon all the time, right? I mean, it's kind of like I don't know. I mean, what's a similar thing? It's like if you were building, I don't know, like statues to Queen Victoria all over India, right? I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, it's even worse than that in the sense of I mean, to what extent were the Brits really genocidal toward the Indians? I think is up for there were obviously horrific crimes done, but I mean, Russia has really, really tried to wipe Ukrainian identity out of the history books, right? In multiple ways. Like, it wasn't just Catherine the Great. Stalin tried it. Many have tried to just eliminate Ukraine, but Ukraine persists. And I mean, it's really extraordinary the extent to which it does persist.
So we're coming up on almost an hour here, Paul. Do you have any questions you want to ask me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually really interested in your perspective as, you know, having paid such close attention to this and being a former Air Force guy. Like, I mean, when you look at what the admin and what Congress have done, when you look at U.S. policy, I mean, what's your evaluation?
What do you mean by U.S. policy? You mean like military policy?
All of it. The money, the support, the weapons given. I mean, I guess it's kind of like I'm in the churn of this so often, the day to day and stuff like that. It's nice to step back and get this.
There was this clip that recently went viral of Senator John McCain in 2014 or 2015, where he basically predicted everything that happened. I think he passed away in 2018 or 19, but you know, he said that after Russia invaded Crimea, the Ukrainians were begging NATO or the United States to give them weapons, to give them stuff for them to defend themselves, because they thought Russia was going to do it again, the Donbass region or the whole country or whatever. And John McCain was saying it's the official security policy of the United States not to help the Ukrainians because we don't want to provoke the Russians. The thought is that if we start giving them advanced military equipment, if we had given them HIMARS 8 years ago, then that would provoke the Russian military to take action. But what if that happened? What if that scenario played out where Russia invaded Crimea and then the United States immediately started sending javelins and stingers and HIMARS and howitzers, and then Russia invaded? It'd be our fault. History for the rest of time would then say, well, the United States provoked Russia. They gave them weapons. It's really sad and unfortunate that it had to play out this way, that we had to wait for Russia to attack first before helping the Ukrainians to absolve ourselves of blame. Otherwise, we would have been blamed maybe by the Ukrainians. If we had been giving them weapons and then Russia invaded, Ukrainians could then blame America for Russia's aggression, when in reality we knew that Putin was going for the whole thing the whole time. I also just want to say it, as far as national security experts, think tanks, all these people, they weren't sure if Ukraine would resist, if Ukraine would actually fight back. What if you do send in fighter jets and tanks and all this stuff, and then the military takes a bribe and rolls over and hands over the country to Putin? It's kind of like the Taliban taking all this military equipment in Afghanistan. It's an embarrassment. It's a national security problem for us. So it's really unfortunate the way that everything is played out, but it makes sense to me. Like, when you recreate the events of the last 8 years, I see the compelling arguments, and I'm confident. You know, prior to myself joining the Air Force, it's fun to indulge in conspiracy theories. It's fun to say, well, the United States did this because, you know, oil money or corruption or whatever. Sure. But having actually served for 6 years in the Air Force as an officer, everyone that I spoke to, everyone that I worked with, everyone I interacted with, they're all fantastic people. They're all trying to do the right thing. So going up the chain of command all the way to the White House, I do think that obviously America's priorities are number one, but they were taking into account NATO, the EU, and Ukraine. They wanted to do what was best for Ukraine, and you have to have a debate and you have to make decisions. And where we got to where we are is where we are, and all we can do at this point is the best we can to help Ukraine. And that's what I'm trying to do with my YouTube channel and talking about what's going on. And I appreciate other individuals like you out there fighting the good fight every day on social media to do what you can.
You're doing a great job. If I may just respond very briefly, because I think that that's a very well articulated perspective. I mean, it's definitely glass half full. I mean, I certainly would have given the weapons, right? And I kind of feel like we should have given the weapons, and we should have seen the writing on the wall much earlier. And I think I agree with you on the notion of, don't suspect, malfeasance where incompetence can explain it, or where simply bureaucracy can explain it, But what you say with think tanks not believing that Ukraine would fight, I mean, I certainly think that we have been, the American mind has been somewhat conditioned by Iraq and Afghanistan almost to expect failure in a sense, like, and I think that, a lot of think tanks right about that. There were a lot of think tankers though that were going to the Valdai Club, right? I mean, if you've heard of this gathering hosted by Russia with access to Russian oligarchs and access to Russian, policymakers and so on and so forth. So there was this kind of almost bribery going on to have this access, right? And then write positively about Russia or adopt Russia's narrative. One of the things I think we really missed, and I guess maybe this is my final point, because I do really think this is important, is for a very long time, we have been adopting and believing Russian narratives and largely dictating our policy toward the region based off interactions with Moscow. And we've kind of ignored the Baltic states and Ukraine and Poland and Finland and so on and so forth. I mean, we've missed states that have been kind of screaming that this was going to happen for 20 years, right? I mean, they were saying, I mean, you talk about McCain there, and McCain was absolutely right, but then all these other countries, they were saying this was going to happen too. So I think one thing we can definitely do better going forward is listening to these countries that may not, in our minds, qualify as great powers or however we were categorizing Russia, because it turned out every single assumption we had about Russia was wrong. Russia was weak. Russia's military was a mess. Ukraine was much stronger. We absorbed and internalized Russia's lies, it feels like, in a really profound way. And when I say we, I mean kind of the G7, right? I mean, and I just don't want to see us making that same mistake again with vis-a-vis Russia or vis-a-vis China or whatever else, but, I mean, I'll have to, consider your perspective, because it's a nice, I think it's an interesting and important other perspective.
I think the analogy I can give you is you're walking down the streets, and it's late at night, and a man walks up to you and pulls what looks like a gun on you and says, "Give me your phone and wallet." Is it a real gun? The responsible thing is just to hand over your phone and wallet, because it's not worth dying over. Russia has been pointing these thousands of nuclear warheads at U.S. cities for 70, 80 years now. And the responsible thing for any elected official in a democratic country is to look out for the safety and security of their people by just not provoking them. And I don't want to say giving them what they want, but obviously you want to take precautions and be responsible. But at the same time, Russia has known this. North Korea knows this, that if you just act insane, maybe you get what you want sometimes. Is that just? Is that fair? Is that right? No, but for the other person, sometimes it's the responsible thing to do, just to not risk it.
But is it not then incumbent upon us to try to see through that threat? I mean, obviously, if you give in to every nuclear threat, we might as well just annex New York City to Russia, right? I mean, then they can just threaten their way into everything, So, I mean, there needs to be lines that you draw, and there needs to be times when you're ready to fight. And I mean, Russia's also doubly complicated because, I mean, in your analogy, Russia, they pull the gun on you, they demand your wallet, you give them your wallet, then they beat you over the head, and then they call the cops on you and tell the cops that you're the problem, they're the victim. You know, I mean, Russia's, you know, it's just, I feel like Russia plays us a lot. They have this, I don't know, this way about them that really abuses our legalistic open framework.
I think Russia's empire of lies is collapsing on them currently. I make this argument. Yes, the Ukrainian military is very valiant and heroic, and they're doing amazing. But the only way to defeat Russia is politically and economically. Someone needs to take out Putin one way or another. And the economic pressure has to be so unbearable for the elites and ruling class and educated people that they accept reforms, either with the help of the West or internally amongst themselves. But how can you continue existing like this? How can you continue? Like my last video, I was showing clips from their New Year's Eve celebration as if everything in Russia is fantastic. You know, let's party like it's, 2022 because everything is great. Double thumbs up on the camera, smiles and laughs. The joke, I read a comment on my channel. The joke was, everyone in the audience was told that if you don't look happy and smile, you're going to get thrown out a window.
Yeah.
The cameras are on.
I mean, I believe it. Absolutely.
And you have to perform.
Totally.
Who would want to live like that every day, all day for the rest of time? Like, this is going to eventually end, and hopefully 2023 is the year. But all right,
well,
Paul.
Let's end on that. Yeah, let's Ukrainian victory in 2023.
Just final words you want to say to the audience?
Oh, I mean, just thanks for having me on. That was wonderful. Great to chat with you, Jake. And I mean, Slava Ukraina.
And for those who don't know Paul, but you made it this far, definitely go check out his YouTube channel. Give him a sub, give him a comment. I'm sure he would greatly appreciate it. He's one of the good ones out there fighting every day for Ukraine.
Yeah, on my way to catching up to Jake. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah.
All right, everyone. Have a good day.